that will come from that, but also share that with the rest of the world. We know there's much more that needs to be done. What we accomplished with the Inflation Reduction Act is something that has never been done before in our country, nor any other country. So I salute our president because it was part of his agenda addressing the climate crisis and about justice and fairness and inclusiveness and diversity and how we go forward. It was contained in our rescue package that we passed, contained in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, $60 billion for diversity and equity, inclusiveness. It was in the CHIPS Act in terms of research and science and STEM and education for everyone, diversity, again, inclusion, equity, fairness, and all the legislation that we passed, even our Veterans Bill, which is Veterans Day, so I want to particularly acknowledge that, which ended the burn pits cross that our soldiers were bearing. So in every way, the president has said, when we do this, we want to do it right. And to do it right, we have to listen to those who are affected the most, whether it's the vulnerable nations or the vulnerable people in our own community. So I salute the president. And I also want to salute Kathy Castor. Kathy Castor is the chair of the Select Committee addressing the climate crisis. The report that her committee, and many of the committee members are here, the report that they put forth was historic, and it was the basis for the Inflation Reduction Act. I yield to Kathy Castor.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kathy Castor of Florida, the chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Very honored to be representing the United States of America along with my colleagues here today, including the champions, the climate champions from our climate committee, who you've already said, but I've got to recognize them again: Rep. Bonamici, Rep. Huffman, Rep. Kasten, and Rep. Escobar. They really were part of a historic effort in the United States of America that started way back, but came to fore just a couple of years ago with a broad outreach effort, listening first to the scientists who said, we must act now. We're in a climate emergency and we're running out of time to address the climate crisis. Their work culminated in the Solving the Climate Crisis Action Plan that compiled recommendations from stakeholders all across the country, across the globe, and how the United States of America could tackle the climate crisis. It did become the basis for the Inflation Reduction Act, our historic climate law, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, our bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and additional action through the National Defense Authorization Act and our appropriations bills, because we have to keep working in everything that we do. But the Inflation Reduction Act in particular allows us to meet President Biden's goals of cutting climate pollution by 50 to 52% by 2030, and it keeps us on track of getting to net zero as soon as possible and no later than 2050. And when you reflect upon this last term of Congress, these last 2 years with President Biden's leadership and the leadership of Speaker Pelosi, the strongest speaker in the history of the House of Representatives, no matter what happens in this midterm election, the most effective Speaker of the House in history, who has made climate action her flagship issue and has never given up from the time of a decade ago where we voted on another energy climate package that didn't get through the Senate at that time, but we knew what was at stake, our moral obligation to act, to reduce climate pollution, and to meet our ambitious climate goals. So the Inflation Reduction Act, in essence, it cuts cost for consumers and it cuts pollution. And we hope that it can be a model for other countries across the planet to act. It creates jobs, and it helps us avoid the costly catastrophes that we are all experiencing. I come from the state of Florida. We just were hit by another hurricane. We don't get hurricanes usually in November. And when you reflect upon the pain and damage in Pakistan with the floods, or Nigeria, here on the continent of Africa, the extreme heat, the droughts, these are expensive, and they come at a time when we're all dealing with global inflation, exacerbated by Putin's unprovoked aggression on Ukraine that has exacted a toll and is raising costs for everyone. And we know the pathway out is clean, affordable energy, not to be tied to petro-dictators any longer. So the Inflation Reduction Act helps us along that path. But here we are at COP27, working with countries across the globe in advancing global action, reducing emissions, and enhancing resilience. And now we've all got to build on those outcomes. Time is of the essence to do so. The United States is working hard to ramp up its support for vulnerable nations and developing countries, especially to respond to the climate emergency and implement the Paris Agreement, lower cost for everyone. The President has pledged to quadruple climate funding from the Obama administration peak, delivering $11 billion annually by 2024 in finance to support countries in their efforts to decarbonize their economies and advance climate-friendly land use practices. Here in the House of Representatives, we have passed in this year's appropriations bill over $3 billion to keep our promise and to follow President Biden's leadership. We also intend to do more when it comes to enhancing efforts through public and private finance, through the World Bank, through modernization of the IMF, through what we do year after year in the Peace Corps, through USAID, through NASA and NOAA, through building these partnerships that will support our allies in all countries across the planet to meet our moral obligation. I will also want to salute the Special Envoy, John Kerry, who has led with great effectiveness for many years. And I hope the other countries will join in what America is trying to lead on, including the Green Shipping Challenge, the Global Methane Pledge, the First Movers Coalition, the Africa Adaptation Initiative, early warning systems for all, so that we can meet this moment. It's a historic moment of climate action out of the United States of America that we're very proud of, and we hope it will help us build momentum to cut costs for everyone and cut pollution and meet our moral obligation to save the planet. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And now I want to yield to the distinguished chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, a committee that has tremendous jurisdiction over, well, if you ask them, they have jurisdiction over everything. But in terms of the meeting that we are at today, I want to thank Mr. Pallone for his leadership and yield to him.
Well, thank you. Let me just echo what Kathy Castor said about you and your effectiveness, Madam Speaker. You definitely are the most effective speaker we've ever had, in my opinion. And let me also thank Kathy and the members of the special committee for all that you've done over the last few years to initiate so much of the climate action plan that we're so proud of. I just wanted to say, I was at previous conferences when Trump was president, and he was trying to take us out of the Paris Agreement. And I was so proud to see that Nancy Pelosi led a delegation to make the point to everyone that the United States was still very much in this. And today it's very easy to make that point because of the Inflation Reduction Act, because of the infrastructure bill, and so many things that have already been mentioned. But the main thing I just wanted to say is that we're here to demonstrate that the United States continues its commitment with our global partners in the fight against climate change. And we're here to reaffirm our determination to accelerate our transition to a stronger, more equitable, and sustainable future. And in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, I just wanted to make it clear that this bill was the single largest investment in climate action in American history. It drove cuts in methane pollution, established a national greenhouse gas reduction fund, and supported the deployment of clean energy technologies across every sector of the economy. These are, of course, the things that came out of the Energy and Commerce Committee. But in conjunction with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the other things that have been mentioned, it's really put us on track to meet the climate targets set forth in the Paris Agreement. I just wanted to mention today, just as an example, the President has already talked about or put out a statement this morning, I think he's going to talk more about it this afternoon, about methane pollution. And basically, I think most of you know methane is one of the most dangerous of a potent greenhouse gas. And what he's basically he's talking about today, and he already put out the summary of it, is that the Inflation Reduction Act created all these new tools to fight methane and other pollutants. And so, as an authorizing committee, what was in the Inflation Reduction Act was primarily tools to fight pollution. And the methane and what he's putting forth today is a real perfect example of that. But lastly, I want to say that we still have to do more to achieve a clean, sustainable future, and we're going to continue the fight. And regardless of what happens in the consequences of the last election, I just want our global partners to know that Democrats are prepared to fight any Republican attempts to undermine these gains. Republicans have made it clear that they're going to push an extreme agenda that favors fossil fuel and corporate special interests over the interests of the American people and our allies. And Democrats are here to make it clear that we're going to aggressively oppose any proposal that would gut or weaken our hard-won climate achievements, because they were hard-won. And just solving this global problem requires global cooperation, and we're not going to falter in our commitment or in our determination to tackle the climate crisis head-on, as we've done in the last Congress. And thank you again, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pallone. Thank you. Mr. Pallone's statement demonstrates the specificity and the knowledge that was brought to bear in writing this legislation. That's because in his committee and the other committees of jurisdiction, but in terms of select committee, everyone was at the table. Business and labor, environmentalists and business, environmentalists and labor, people of faith, concerned scientists, farmers, venture capitalists, you name it, everyone was at the table so that we had full knowledge of the ramifications of one aspect or another of the legislation. And everything that is in the report is not in the bill. That's more that needs to be done. But what is in the bill is so powerful, thanks to the leadership of the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Richie Neal. Thank you, Richie, and thank you to Mike Thompson of California who helped with this, and Mr. Blumenauer, too, on the tax credits. Mr. Neal.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. I can testify to the greatness of the Speaker talking about her role in history. I think I've served with most of the speakers, that's why. You frequently will watch concluding remarks in the well of the House of Representatives where members with some flourish and sometimes with hyperbole will say, the world is watching. Well, the world was watching, is watching, and universally have offered a claim to the legislation that we wrote. Overwhelmingly, the Inflation Reduction Act is tax policy. We use the incentives constructed in the policy to seek certain outcomes. And as we heard from John Kerry last night, we heard from Al Gore last night, but we heard from foreign leaders across the board that America spoke with the Inflation Reduction Act. What's striking about these $370 billion worth of tax incentives is it addresses the issue that is fundamental to our system, and it's called risk-taking. So we reward the risk takers through sensible tax policy, and we have applied what is known as the tax expenditure, meaning you invest through the tax system. Many of these ventures that are taking place They're still on the cusp. It's going to be hard for them to get some of them over the goal line, but you want to reward long-term investment, and the best way to do that, making sure that those stakeholders keep some skin in the game, is with tax policy. I think it's to be preferred, and sometimes to grant policy, largely because of tax policy, you have to stay with it, and that's what we did over a 10-year period. I do want to acknowledge Mike Thompson and Earl Blumenauer in particular. They stayed with the construction of these incentives in the code. In addition, I also want to point out that it strikes me that the acclaim that we have received here is going to also prompt and incent the rest of the world to say the risk-taking that America has done, the most substantive offering as it relates to climate change in the history of the world, has been done by the Democratic Party. We decided that we were going to proceed based upon Joe Biden's assertion that these items were achievable and doable, and we have reacted accordingly. So thanks to the Speaker for her continued confidence in all of us. And I want to thank in particular the Ways and Means Committee, Democrats, who put this legislation out and stayed with it through difficult moments. Tax policy does two things. It frequently will bring aboard advocates, and it will bring aboard resistance. We were able to achieve what the advocates desired in this instance.
Thank you very much. As you were speaking, I was thinking of the process that everyone went through and thinking that America is such a blessed country, and we're blessed by our first Americans. And at the table and in the discussions on how the legislation went through, we were very blessed by the contribution of Native Americans and our Indian country constituents and friends. They know the land, they think generations ahead, and we couldn't possibly do infrastructure or any of these issues that relate to climate without their involvement. With that, I want to yield to the distinguished chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who's talking, well, he'll tell you what he wants to talk about, but thank you for your leadership. Gregory Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to join my colleagues in thanking you for making sure that climate is always on our mind, even after we were pulled out of the Paris Agreement by the former president. You never stopped, you never lost vision, you continued to fight, and you brought all of us. That's why we have such a large delegation here today of members under your leadership to make sure that everybody knows the United States of America is back at the table. And that's what took place when we first visited COP26 last year. And we're here today following the commitments that were made at COP26 is taking place here at COP27. You know, since then, the United States has taken concrete and significant. COP26, right after that, commitments were made, significant steps were taken, and most significantly, the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, the most significant climate legislation in our nation's history. And I'm proud that, as chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, we followed the direction of the Speaker and President Joe Biden, and we began to hold numerous hearings on the climate crisis, informing both the American people and the world on our committee's work. We've then worked very closely with the State Department and USAID to support initiatives that address climate change, many of which is in the historic Inflation Reduction Act. And we've advocated for more resources to assist the developing world and so they can avoid dependency on fossil fuels, and so that their voices are heard and are at the table. So we specifically have worked to shine a light on the consequences that climate change poses to indigenous groups around the world, who often contribute the least to climate change and are yet the most vulnerable to its impacts. Just last week, in fact, I led a congressional delegation to the Pacific Islands, to Palau and Papua New Guinea and Australia, where we saw firsthand the outsized costs indigenous and local communities face from climate change, and how climate change is impacting citizens' ability to put food on the table and their ability to withstand storms that have now become more regular and more severe. In fact, we witnessed one while we were there. Lastly, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only underscored our over-reliance on oil and gas and our need to find clear energy sources, independent of oil and gas-rich states that control their flow. Clean energy is not only necessary for mitigating climate change, it is a requirement for energy independence. And so I'm grateful again to join this delegation along with Speaker Pelosi, that she's put us together to make sure that the word goes out that we are going to save this planet. We will not be silent. We're going to follow up on our commitments, and we're going to make sure that the voices of all, the indigenous, the vulnerable people, are heard, and we work collectively together to make sure that this place that we call Earth, because there's one place that we all share, is this planet. And we've all got to work together to make sure we have something for all of us. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I want to yield to, as we go forward, to the chair of the subcommittee on appropriations, state foreign operations, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who controls the purse strings on how we go forward. But Barbara, I just have to say we've been given a 5-minute warning for the room, so.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will try to stick to my 1 minute. And I want to thank you for your tremendous leadership once again on the world stage. You've demonstrated, I tell you, your unbelievable understanding of what a global leader means. And so thank you again for this. And also to our delegation, and especially to Chair Kathy Castor for showing what we can do together as Democrats, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act, and how since we've been here, everywhere we go, every meeting we have, people really understand the impact of the climate provisions of the bill. So thank you again very much for that. Very quickly, last year, of course, at COP26 in Glasgow, the President and the Democratic Congress have proudly enacted, since last year, the most significant climate investment in United States history, putting us back on track to slash carbon pollution by 40% this decade. And as chair of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, I'm committed to furthering these gains and these goals. Chair Castor mentioned the $11 billion which the President is putting forth, has pledged to address adaptation, resilience, and in his 2023 budget, if we get it negotiated the way he intends it and we intend it, we'd be way ahead of achieving our goals before the scheduled date. In this bill this year, we include $1.6 billion in the International Green Climate Fund to help developing countries mitigate climate impacts, to reduce emission, and to fight climate change. And it's so important, I think, that we're here on the continent of Africa because we have heard over and over again the issues with regard to developing countries, vulnerable states. Here we met also with civil society and NGOs, and so much of what we heard and learned here we know is happening also in the United States. And so putting together this entire strategy out of this conference is so important that the developed world live up to our commitments, and I think that we're on track to do that. And I want to thank the Speaker and this delegation for keeping us on track. Finally, I'll just say, back in my home state, the Speaker's home state, Congressman Huffman's home state of California, we're already seeing the effects of the climate crisis in the form of droughts, wildfires, waves, floods that have devastated entire communities. The United Nations and scientists around the world have made it clear that we can still preserve a sustainable future for future generations. But as Chair Castro said, that window is closing fast. So we must work together, follow through on our commitments, and change this collective trajectory. So thank you again, Madam Speaker, for that, and look forward to getting our bill negotiated and the investments made this year through the appropriations process.
Thank you so much for your great leadership. In closing, I just want to thank the government of Egypt, the president, the foreign minister, for hosting COP27, doing so with a theme of Africa as well, because we learned so much from this continent about where we go from here. We want to be able to, again, as Congresswoman, Madam Chair said earlier, think in terms of the multilateral development banks and Mr. Neal talking about the private sector taking a piece of, so that we can, whatever resources we can, they would be leveraged to a much greater amount so that we can help these countries, and so that they don't have to use their money and have an opportunity cost for food and education and the rest for their children. We listened very carefully to the vulnerable nations and their members of parliament about how we can work together as we go forward. One thing you have to know is that we have left incrementalism in the dust. This is about transformation. We hope that this COP27 will be the threshold that we all cross to remove all doubt that we are, as a world, serious about saving the planet for the children, and to doing so that listens to those affected most, brings the most diversity and the most justice, environmental justice, economic justice, social justice, to the issues that we, as we address the climate crisis. Do we have time for one question? One question? Who's going to recognize? That's a level of politics I don't get involved in. Okay, did you decide who was? Yes, sir. Okay, right there. He has proximity, so there we are.
مصطفى عبد الفتاح، القاهرة الإخبارية، قناة القاهرة الإخبارية. السؤال what's the future relation of American and Egyptian? What's the future American and Egyptian future?
Oh. Well, in terms of saving the planet, it's a very close one. That's what we're here to do. But our relationship is 100 years old, and it is one that is strong in areas of security, in areas of economy, in areas we have a close relationship with Egypt. And again, Jimmy Carter, I just heard from him the other day, and I remember the Camp David Accords, which is very important to the security in the region. So we have a good relationship with Egypt, yes. And we had a good visit with the president. We're friends, and friends can be very candid with each other, and we have been. Yeah. I just said, do you say one more from a woman? From a woman? I just like hearing from, they have something else happening, so we'll walk out together. There's another press conference coming in. Thank you all very much.